Hi, I wonder if you've ever given a talk that you planned really well. You thought very carefully about the people in the room, the tone you should use. You worked hard on the content, hard on the steps in it. You thought carefully about what examples to use. You really practiced it to make sure your tone and delivery was down, and it fell flat. It's like no one in the room took it in. And you come home at the end and go, oh, why do I even bother? Now, it's possible you're not actually doing anything wrong. It's possible that all the pieces you put in and the hard work you put in was worthwhile, but it's also possible that what you've done is you demanded a very specific type of attention for a very prolonged period of time. This is when we need to up our speaking game. Not to become a more interesting person to listen to, but to properly understand what's happening in your listener as they're listening and know how to sort of swim in those waters. So I want to give you a couple of tips today to advance your public speaking skills, not to make you a better sounding speaker, but genuinely a better speaker. So let's begin with how people pay attention. We often think that listening is like a light switch. Either they're listening or they're not listening. It's 100% or nothing. It's just not how people listen. You might have people in the room who are at the sort of 0 to 10% range who are genuinely not listening. They're so not listening, they're so unattentive to what's going on that they start creating noise and space as if they were alone in a room or hanging out with their mates, and that's genuinely not listening. But beyond that, the sort of 10% to 30% is when people are listening to the point of view that they're hearing what you're saying, but they're also thinking about how comfortably they're sat in their seat, work they've got to do at home, they're thinking about other people and conversations they've had. You're sort of in parallel with another experience going on in their life. Now, it also might be when you get beyond that, you get to the sort of 30 to 60 percentile, I'm making these numbers up completely. They're listening with a bit more, at least sympathy, if not empathy. So they're listening and going, yeah, that actually might affect me. Oh, that is actually mildly interesting. Oh, that was quite funny. Oh, I remember that. And they're starting to dialogue who they are with what you're saying. And then the gold standard, the sort of 70 to 100% listening, is where they're empathizing with what you're saying so deeply that you've got their attention. They are riveted. They couldn't turn away if they tried. Everything you say is like, oh, me too, and they're having a real emotional response. I think oftentimes when we're public speaking, especially to young people, what we're expecting is that. We think they're not really listening and it's not really worth it if they're not fully engaged, fully empathizing. It's why we overuse very emotional stories in youth work speaking to try to keep hooking them in. The problem is, if you're demanding that kind of 70 to 100% attention, that means you're asking something from them intellectually, emotionally, personality-wise, identity-wise. They're having to retain and remember, and you're asking them to be invested. Full heart invested in everything you're saying. We just can't do that for very long. Humans are not designed to push through that full level of empathy and intellectual response and retention all the time. Our minds, our hearts, our energies need rest from that. It's why movies don't have just constant emotional death scenes or romance scenes one after the other. We have to go through a cycle. The other thing I think we misunderstand about people's attention span or how they listen in a talk is thinking they do so in a linear progression, A then B then C. They've listened to point A and now they're listening to point B and now they're listening to point C as you have prepared to deliver them. The problem is, maybe you said something in point A they didn't quite understand, or was very funny, or they disagreed with, and they're sort of mulling it over, and now you're on to point C, and they're going, I don't get point C. What happened in point B? And we're trying to dig into where maybe they were in that sort of 10 percentile listening to that point, but they can't get the pieces anymore, so they've stuck the wrong things together, and all of a sudden, you've lost a significant part of your talk. And especially if you were using your talk like a ladder, you need point A to get to point B to understand point C. Your talk's been a wash on that person because they haven't climbed the ladder with you. So what do we do about these things? Well, first, it's important to remember that you don't need to keep people at that 100 percentile all the time. What I want to do is I want to keep people in the middle. I want to keep people at the sort of 60 to 70% range where they're constantly thinking, oh, that's interesting. Oh, I get that. Oh, I can sympathize with that. And occasionally I want to bring them up to, oh, that really changes me. I really get that. I don't want to drop below 60. I don't want to start thinking about other things in the world. I want them to really be at that restful but interested stage most of the time. So when I plan my talks, I ask questions of the points I'm making and ask what am I demanding from the listener here. And if I'm demanding a lot all the way through, I start looking for where I can tone areas down. Now that might feel counterintuitive, but just like providing proper context to anything, if you are speaking well in the areas you want more attention and speaking well in a particular way that allows them just to not coast, but engage in a less demanding way for the rest of the time, you will allow your audience to really take in the things you wanted them to take in at the times you want them to take them in, and you'll provide enough emotional, intellectual rest time that they can do that in a way which will increase retention. The second thing, I'd encourage you to ditch the traditional 1, 2, 3 method of talking. Step 1, step 2, step 3. We still plan talks and deliver talks like we are delivering an enlightenment-styled deductive reasoned argument where premise A requires premise B in order to reach a conclusion. This is the 3-point sermon. 3 points, each told one way each, with maybe an application at the end or maybe 3 different applications. Please, let's ditch the 3 points sermon, the 3 points talk. Instead, I encourage you to think about how you can get 1 point down incredibly clearly. The one win, the one thing you want everyone to take home with you, and teach that in several ways. Let's just stick with 3 points, ABC. If ABC are each saying effectively the same thing in a slightly different way, using a similar refrain or a similar memorable word or phrase or question, if you are re-engaging the same point and are being interesting enough to vary that with different examples and styles of speaking, it's likely that everyone in the room is going to get it. It's also possible, if you're varying that enough carefully, that people who weren't tuned in at one bit will be tuned in others, and that will swap with other types of people too. Like you'll be engaging different types of listener. Okay, I'll do one more. There's a lot to say about this. But another thing that often loses people or doesn't engage or doesn't lift people through one type of retention to another is how we transition within the talk itself. And so talks are collections effectively of ideas and values and points and concepts. And how you move from one to the other is very important. For example, if you were to say, all sociopaths drive white cars, so if you drive a white car, you're probably a sociopath. The 2 points there is people who and you are. And you've connected them with a so. Now that's an outlandish and random and interesting enough made up point that people probably engage with you anyway. But a few days ago, I was helping a member of my team write a talk, and they were trying to talk about mental health as opposed to mental sickness. And they'd asked a very good question, which was, what do you think of when you think of mental health, and put it to the young people in the room. And then what they were going to do when they fed back, because when they fed back exactly the way you'd think, which is talk about anxiety and depression and PTSD and BPD, and they thought about mental illnesses and sicknesses and issues and struggles. And what the leader who was speaking wanted to do was make them think about positive mental health, what it means to have mental fitness. And so what they were originally going to do is ask the question and say, yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, how we all think of sickness, so what about mental health? And they moved on to talk about positive mental health. And again, just like the sociopathic white cars thing, they were linked by a so, and it was still very much delivered in the same style, same tone, and it didn't do anything to connect us to the next point. So these internal transitions, maybe the easiest thing to say is get rid of the word so. Because so, in internal transitions, makes it sound like really it's part of the same point. And so what you want to do is make people feel like they're on one path, and now they've had to take a side step to another path, still going in the same direction. Like if you were hiking, you had to hop over a rock. You need something to move them from one way of thinking into a slightly different way of thinking, but still going in the same direction. When I mark essays, I love to use the word signposting. In fact, if you're listening to this or watching this and I've marked one of your essays and I've used the word signposting, you know exactly what I mean. Signposting is you've written a paragraph and then you've written a second paragraph that has nothing to do with the first one, not obviously anyway. You have to signpost, you have to point to why are you following this with that? Why is this linked to the thing that you just said? And so you want the points to be linked, absolutely, but also they need to be distinct enough, separate enough. You need to do something to move them out of that space. And so in the case of the mental health, mental fitness, what I said is, okay, well, stop for a second and introduce a second question. Maybe you should say something like, okay, who's the fittest person you know? So we just had the whole mental health thing. What do you think of mental health? That's brilliant. Thank you so much for thinking about all those things. That's really interesting. Anxiety, depression. Let me ask you another question. Who's the fittest person you know? Not as like, oh, they've got gorgeous eyes. Who's the most attractive, physically healthy person you can think of? Think of like athletes. Who are you thinking of when you think of, oh wow, they're so fit and healthy? So you get some examples, probably some funny conversations, people are empathizing now because it's who they think are fit. And then at the end of that, you say, isn't it interesting that none of you said, oh, that person's really fit because they don't have any diseases? Or that person's fit because they don't have any health problems. When we think of all kinds of health and fitness, we think of thriving, flourishing. We think about how much beyond just baseline boring and just fine they are. Why don't we do that with mental health? You see, the difference here is we've jolted them to a new road heading in the same direction. So work on your internal transitions. If you want people to connect with a point of surprise or interest or empathy or new movement, you need to do more than just so. You need to move them through internal transitions in a way that connects up, but also makes people open their eyes a little bit differently. Hopefully this is helpful. I'm sort of spitballing here. There's quite a lot I could say. I've been a public speaker since I was about 14, and I've done a lot wrong, and I have a bit of a speech impediment myself, so I had to work hard at this. But I've also done vocal speaking. I can say I'm very good at this. I've done vocal coaching, public speaking coaching. I used to freelance helping people write and prepare and deliver elevator pitches to investors for their businesses. It's something I think a lot about, and because I do have incredible attention problems myself and I'm dyslexic, it's really important for me to think about how do we engage people well when we speak. So hopefully that was useful. Thanks, folks.